can I introduce my boss, Rob Clark, Chief of Southern IFCA.
Hello, good afternoon. Thank you very much for the opportunity to present this afternoon. I will be presenting on the perhaps lesser understood or lesser discussed aspect of marine protected area management that is concerned with compliance. John has asked me to condense my talk rather rapidly and finish a bit earlier than was anticipated. And anyone who knows me will know that that's going to be next to impossible. But I will try and rattle through this subject area. In so doing, I would like to dedicate the talk to the IFCOs, the Inshore Fisheries and Conservation Officers, who are out there at sea and on land, both day and night, enforcing these regulations. For whilst the implementation of policy and laws, which introduce measures which are designed to protect our marine environment, ultimately their success often depends on their implementation through compliance. So in this talk, I'll be looking at the ingredients in compliance and what makes for successful compliance. The story has been told about the rapid expansion of our marine protected area network. IFCAs, as you know, were created in 2011. And since that time, huge areas have been designated and management has been introduced, some of which we've heard about today. Today, now, something over 50% of our inshore waters are designated in one form or another as a marine protected area. The amount and scale of our designations and protections has far exceeded that which we see on land as an equivalent. Whereas on land, as an equivalent, you would expect to have park rangers, wardens, etc., implementing management which has been developed elsewhere. Whereas at sea, in terms of fisheries regulations and compliance, we have not seen a corresponding increase in the number of fishery officers employed. So you have, in our inshore waters, not just concerned with implementing management of marine protected areas, but also generally fisheries regulations, pretty much the same number of fishery officers inshore as you had in 2011. So talking specifically about Southern IFCA district, we have a little under 3,000 square kilometres. It's a diverse environment. I mean, other IFCA areas are available, and you've heard some of the stories from them, but of course this is the most interesting and diverse, for reasons that I will explain shortly. And I would expect my colleagues to challenge that comment. But we have a large number of marine protected areas. The varying colours there, which you'll be familiar with, denote the different types of designations. And within each of those sites, we have different forms of management. I will be turning back to Paul. Other MPA management measures are available, but I think particularly as we heard from Sarah in a brilliant talk, if I may be so bold as to say, which illustrated the management there really well, I wanted to go back to then what compliance means today in those sites. And Tommy is in the crowd, and he can correct me if I'm wrong, I'm sure. So let's start at the beginning, for it matters the stories that we tell. Marine protected areas are there to protect things. They're protecting really important features. Birds, very often, in our SPAs, of course, and the habitats. Those habitats are really important, and they're very important also, of course, for many fisheries. And as I say, the stories that we tell about our intertidal areas for birds matter, because the stories that we tell begin the journey to compliance. And so as we've gone through these talks, I think some of us might be forgiven for considering that there is a preoccupation and a focus on commercial fisheries and regulating commercial fisheries, but the regulations that have been introduced through IFCAs, in Southern IFCA in particular, and other IFCAs, who it is their job to promote them, so I won't do their job for them, but in our inshore waters, across the IFCA districts, the protection of important habitats and species is bringing important ecosystem benefits and services. As I say, the stories that we tell matter. black bream. We've got 3 new sites with black bream as a designated feature. In the 1970s, pictures of black bream as a consequence of angling competitions were abound, with hundreds of fish brought up and weighed in and measured and left to die on the quaysides. That doesn't happen today. It doesn't happen necessarily just because of regulation. It happens because of the stories that we tell. The more that we tell of the stories of the breeding biology, in this case of black bream, and how they nest and how they mate and look after the eggs matter, because people then can understand why the management is necessary of these species. Because if we don't look after those sites, they won't continue to yield and become important for those coastal communities. So some of you will be thinking, what's he talking about? I thought this was a compliance talk. But the point is the stories that we tell and how we tell them and how we can communicate them enable that dialogue to begin in wider society, but also for the people that we're regulating. I've chosen these rocky reef pictures because they're really pretty, and I've stolen them from lots of different people. But those are images which, 20 years ago we didn't have available to us as managers. We couldn't explain necessarily why our rocky reefs were really important and cool. Who wouldn't want to protect that stuff? So the imaging and the way we communicate the importance of reefs and the work that Emma and others have produced, which show the importance of interstitial, the space between reefs, for reef habitats is really important. And the reason for that is because when it comes to managing our reefs and seagrass areas and intertidal areas, becomes enabled by the way that we're able to show that the protection of these sites can facilitate continued and sustainable fishing, but also contribute to biodiversity. So the designation of sites through policy and then management through regulation resolves essentially locally, as explained, in certain areas, bylaws. So this is an image that you might be perhaps familiar with, which gives an overall picture of the amount of areas which have been closed to bottom-towed fishing gear as a consequence of, amongst other things, the revised approach to European marine sites, the management they're in, but also the management of marine conservation zones. These red areas protect seagrass, reefs, and other areas. And as you can see, just about on that slide, I hope, they're pretty extensive. Coming back to the southern IFCA district, the 2,700 odd kilometres relies on 6 fishery officers to enforce that lot. Which leads me to the next part, which is traditionally where enforcement or compliance officers, and I'm using the term compliance very specifically here because enforcement is a component of compliance, begins. And it is fair to say, and it's a great credit to my colleagues, some of whom are here, including Greg and others, who have really led the development of what's known as an intelligence-led risk-based enforcement scheme. Today, IFCAs have centralised intelligence units. We share information. We share between our officers. We share them between our organisations. We share them with our partners in the MMO, Food Standards Agency, local EHOs. We share that information because very often when we're talking about aspects of food crime, because that's what it very often is involved with, it involves multiple partners. If you look at the global assessment of criminality, top 5, wildlife crime. Wildlife crime involves the stuff that we're talking about, the stuff that Sarah described, illegal fishing within pool, illegal fishing in one of our most highly protected sites, taking food from unclassified waters, potentially killing people if we're not careful about it. So the reconciliation through the work that the IFCAs have done, through developing an intelligence system which shares information, that is able to respond to that information, analyse that information, identify and risk profile information, is really cool and very important. So I pay credit to my colleagues. It's little understood. This is not the stuff that we go very often, many of us in this room, to conferences about. It's a different kind of discipline. It's a different arena. But IFCAs are involved in this, heavily involved in this. And as I said at the start of this conference, start of this presentation, I'd like to pay credit to the officers that are on the ground that are very often able to tell their story with a wider community. But what they're doing, they're looking at likelihood and risk assessments, and here's an example from Southern IFCA. You can't really see it, but this thing here is a spreadsheet. It's looking at all the different fisheries. It's looking at the likelihood of impacts from activities and then the risk of impact. So it's looking at what happens if people are fishing in there. So, for example, level 1, the occurrence is practically impossible. It can't really happen. The impact, there will be no immediate threat. Well, that's a lower risk. Where there's higher risk, for example, level 5, it's a common or repeating occurrence, and that would have an extreme threat. That's where we're putting our limited resources, and you can understand. So that's a process which is ongoing. And we're engaging that community in that process. We're then adding that to it, and it's informed by our intelligence systems. Is it perfect? Well, find a compliance system that is, but it is an essential component of marine protected areas that we don't, it's an important area that needs to be understood and discussed further. More recently, the IFCAs and Southern IFCA as well has developed a technical coordination group. So we sit down with others and discuss those risks. We assess that intelligence, bring it all together, then resolve that tactically. These are tools that the territorial policing has used for some time. But there's intelligence units and tactical coordination groups sitting down, organising how we deliver our responses to those risks. And then we resolve that through the delivery of operational. Of course, this relies on assets, and it can be improved with assets. Intelligence is one component of assets. Our people are the most important component, but other aspects, such as the brilliant innovations that have emerged through Devon and Severn IFCA through the use of IVMS, the national programme that we're working on to try and get that rolled out nationally. The governments generally have a pretty poor record of implementing complicated IT projects, small boats. It's difficult stuff, but it will help and will improve. But it's not a replacement for. I guess the purpose of this was to highlight what's already going on and the significance and role of your IFCOs at sea, on land, and day and night, going out and enforcing this stuff. And I would recommend to get behind them and support what they're up to. So yes, let's have IVMS, but don't forget it's an important component of an integrated compliance system. And so when we get down from that big national picture, we get into areas like Paul, as I've described, and it's pretty complicated to enforce that stuff. We've got 6 people pretty much on this. They're supported by the rest of the team, of course. These are complicated rules. As our rules get more complicated to enable co-management, we've got to understand that there's a resource tail to that. It requires increasing resources. So if you want it more complicated, then it needs more resources. But if you want it simpler, then sometimes you can undermine the very thing that you were trying to achieve, because it's simple. People might not just obey them because they don't make sense. They don't tactically resolve. And if they don't make sense and people break the law, then you didn't achieve any conservation. I've got a video of people not achieving conservation, which hopefully will work. Here we go. So as I say, we've got a group of fishery officers out there, and this is Poole Harbour. This is, as you can see, I can't lie to you, it's the date, 2014, so this is before the management was introduced, and this is a couple of fishery officers at most respect for in my teams, coming across what you might normally associate with perhaps Africa or developing countries, unregistered, unlicensed, illegal fishing. This is in a marine protected area, an area which is closed because it's sensitive, an area which is unclassified because we don't know whether this food is safe. And this is pretty much an industry which is developed with no regulations. They come from illegal moorings, and they're making good money, and why wouldn't they? And so the fishery officers just come alongside, please don't do that. Well, stop what you're doing immediately. No, I won't. Here comes his mate. Oh, hello. So you can see the mud being churned up by here. We're in about sort of 30 centimetres of water here. So, these officers are out there dealing with this stuff. day and night. And good regulation, which involves communities, gets rid of this. We don't have the graph that Sarah showed, the reduction down to nothing, is because the regulations now mean that the offence is just being there with that equipment. Whereas before, we had to show that they were catching it. If I wasn't rattling on, you might have seen him showing the stuff over. Anyway, they've decided they're not going to hang around, and now we're doing 30 knots, trying to evade us through some sensitive areas. So this is going on. Your officers, the IFCA officers, are doing this stuff. So we're talking about, we need to protect stuff. Well, if you get it wrong, if you don't do it right, they'll just do this anyway. And they'll go and rip up your seagrass, and they'll go and take your illegal stuff. I'm overrunning. I always said I was going to. So I tried to consolidate that into some sort of thought process. It's got to be meaningful. It's got to be legitimate. We've got to have a legitimate reason to engage. We've got to communicate that. Stories we tell are so important. We've got to involve people in the decision making. So we've got to make sense. It doesn't mean we've got to do, the wrong thing. We've got to just, got to involve people. We've got to be. The outcomes have got to be fair. If we're managing something, we can communicate the reason for that. Regulation involving that increases the awareness, and it creates moral and social norms. But equally, you still need those fishery officers, and you need the courts to take this stuff seriously. You need a deterrence factor as well.
1 minute.
I'm going to skip over the stuff in Pool because Sarah did such a good job in describing it. But also, there you go. So you wanted to see what happened in that case. He was fined. Another merchant there, £35,000 for that fishery. So it wasn't just the fact that we brought in a regulation that involved co-management. We caught the bad guys as well. And that's the stuff which we're not necessarily telling at these conferences because it's a different kind of story, it's a different kind of discussion. And why it matters? Who knows? Well, no, that's not the positive end that I was going to describe. Because Poole Harbour contains this stuff. And if we don't protect it properly, these are sapella worms. And this diverse habitat is the basis for our strong ecosystems, which provide ecosystem services, not just for commercial fishing. It's not just about creating a livelihood for the clam fishermen. It's about creating a good environment which supports juvenile fish habitats and species, which everyone enjoys, including recreational participants and the commercial fishermen. Thank you very much, John.
Okay. Well, thanks, Rob. That really was a whole different perspective on what we do. Questions for Rob? Yes. Who's that? Oh, yes. Yes, another.
Rob, there's a really good book that everyone in this room should read, which is called What's So Good About Biodiversity? And it's really good philosophical and studied work into the sort of things I think you're trying to talk about, which is, I think, is ecosystem services, which is not very inspiring for natural history filmmakers, but I think inspires me in my job. Do you think the moral and normative understanding of what the marine environment is doing in your fishing community is changing in the last 10 years?
The very short answer would be yes. But probably the more complicated answer is why. I think it's happening because we are having those conversations and we are engaging with the communities in those processes. It takes time. And perhaps when we're faced with time scales, decisions which have to, and resource implications, there seems to be a rush into regulation. And that's a good thing in many regards because if we don't rush towards something, we very often don't do it. But I guess the overall theme of that presentation was that if you can't regulate your way out of some of these problems, you invest at the beginning with engagement and tell the stories correctly, and you then lose aspects of the compliance tail at the end. So when the Poole Harbour stuff was originally built, I don't think anyone in Poole said, let's create an illegal fishery. They just said, we've got to stop stuff, so let's just ban it, or we can only allow a little bit. Well, this has consequences, and those consequences are found in illegality. So the stories we tell are very important in that respect.
Yes, another one.
Tim McPherson from the Angling Trust. Now, the sea, marine environment, is a public resource, isn't it? And effectively, you're managing a public resource. It's not owned by any particular stakeholder group. Trick question, really, but the work that Teb is doing aside, how many people do you think have any idea what you do who are not involved in commercial fishing, recreational angling, or councillors locally, and do you think it's important that IFCAs should be much more visible in their local communities? Because frankly, you know, people look out to sea and they just see a sort of flat expanse of water. They don't understand what they're looking at, and I think maybe we could all do a bit more to make people understand what a fantastic resource they've got out there.
I think there's perhaps, if we had a PR company, we might sack them, but we don't. And why don't we? Because, as I've described, you know, we've got 12 officers for 2,700 square kilometres, and so there's not a lot of slack in the system to do that. But that was, I go back to that key message: the stories we tell are important. A friend of mine, and I might divulge here, divert, and John, you'll, as the chairman, you might tell me if I've strayed too far off piste. A friend of mine studying psychology, and this weekend, she's an undergraduate, she said, can I do an experiment? And I thought immediately I was suspicious. I thought, a psychologist wanting to study me, I'm worried immediately. And there was a series of images, and she said, at the end of this study, she said, which image do you associate with a positive logo? Well, I said, well, none of them. And she said, yeah, that's right. That's the right answer. I thought, oh, I didn't think we were meant to have right answers. It was because we didn't associate, it wasn't associated with a positive image. So very often conservation is associated with a negative image, of course, because we want to change things, we want to implement stuff. But there's a lot of good stuff, a lot of change, however made it small, however, in the global scheme of things, it might be insignificant. But unless we build on the positivity, we can't create a momentum which will take us forward.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Rob Clark.